The Occult War, Chapter 2, The Holy Alliance. Metternich, champion of the counter-revolution. After a century of bitter experiences and utter disappointments, only a very few among our contemporaries have grasped the true meaning of revolution and democracy. Hence, we should not be surprised to find that in 1815, the Allies, for whom this monster was still something new, felt rather confused. Still, the most intelligent statesman of this period, and the least short-sighted one of the 19th century, Prince Metternich, appears to have realized what a terrifying nightmare was looming on the horizon. Metternich never ceased doing his best to make the Congress of Vienna something more than merely a pretty sunset for sovereigns. Of all those gathered in this assembly, which was exclusively comprised of noblemen, Metternich alone managed to rise above the contingent interests of his own country in an attempt to establish a united and enduring front for facing not so much external dangers as the inner peril threatening all European nations. The measures taken to forestall the possibility of Napoleon's comeback were directed less against the great commander than against the man who had proclaimed himself to be the Messiah of the Revolution from the rocks of St. Helena. Napoleon's myth had been usurped by democracy, which had confiscated his laurels in order to conceal its sordid rags under a heroic mantle. Metternich held nothing against France as such, the old traditional France of the Bourbons. What he mistrusted was the country in which the new mentality appeared to have its headquarters. The future was destined to prove just how right Metternich was. The tragedy of the French Revolution had not taken place in vain before Metternich's eyes. He was never to forget this lesson, which had proven useless for many others. He had witnessed the liberal and enlightened Constitution pave the way for the Gironde and the Terror, which had started with embraces and ended with beheadings. He had seen how liberalism is nothing but a prelude to Jacobinism, and harbored no illusions concerning the high-flown words that charmed feeble and suggestible minds. Because of his foresight, Metternich became the greatest bête noire of all the noble, sensitive, and generous hearts who devotedly rallied under the banner of the immortal principles upheld by the faithless and lawless giants of the French Revolution. To this day, when so much evidence can be found to confirm Metternich's ideas, they still blame him for having lumped together Jacobinism and liberalism, free thought, and the nationality principle as expressions of the same sect, plague, and volcano. Metternich was not as blind as many of our contemporary conservatives and nobles. While having been offered so many occasions to study these symptoms in all their apparent diversity, phenomena carefully differentiated so as to only progressively deliver small shocks, these men have failed to realize the intrinsic unity and causal relationships among things that, for over a century, have been mutually distinguished merely as a way of fooling and confounding the short-sighted with a range of different names: liberalism, humanitarianism, tolerance, free thought, modernism, constitutionalism, and parliamentarism, idyllic preludes to Jacobinism, radicalism, communism, the Committee of Public Safety, and the Cheka. Metternich's superiority compared to all other statesmen of his century, not to mention those of later times, lies precisely in the fact that he grasped the evil of the future as a united whole and synthesis. Having gained awareness of this united front, which carries many different names, Metternich sought to assemble all the forces on his side, all those which the revolution regarded as future obstacles, in order to form another united front, transcending national differences and capable of facing the former everywhere in Europe. This unprecedented and creative innovation in the political domain may be summed up as follows. Now in Europe there is no enemy to the right. The corollary of this being, all that which is on the left, or even outside the integral right, is the enemy. From this perspective, Metternich agrees with Lenin but not with any contemporary conservative. The two other men of state from this period whom history books tend to put on the same level as Metternich, namely Cavour and Bismarck, were a great Italian and a great Prussian, or great German at most, whereas Metternich was not so much a great Austrian as a great European. Steeped in the traditions of the Holy Roman Empire, which for centuries had been ruled by his sovereign's forefathers, Metternich was less concerned with his own country of Austria than he was with Europe. He was certainly one of the greatest Europeans after Charlemagne. Metternich was not one of those senseless men for whom the highest diplomatic refinement lies in complacently gazing at a neighbor's house as it catches fire. Men of this sort do not realize they are living in an age in which all houses in the city of Europe conceal explosive material in their basements, their own homes being no exception. Metternich would never have struck an alliance with the Carbonari and the Freemasons, as Cavour did, to serve contingent patriotic interests. In drawing this pact with subversion, Cavour re-established Italy on a slippery slope that was gradually drawing it towards Bolshevism. The country would already have been engulfed had it not been saved against all hopes at a time when everything seemed lost, by a genuine miracle which Cavour could never have foreseen. Metternich would never have encouraged the establishment of a republican democratic regime in a neighboring country under the pretext that it represented a potential rival to be weakened and demeaned. This, however, is precisely what Bismarck did with France, despite being a monarchist and conservative, an unconscious tool of subversion. He found nothing better to do than wage war against the Catholic Church and joined the Jew La Salle. The latter's state socialism was presented as being non-international and capable of reinforcing the administrative and economic centralization of the German Empire. Things were intended to continue in this way until the process of centralization would have reached completion. Then a simple change in personnel would have sufficed to transform this empire, governed by an aristocratic oligarchy, apparently as powerful as ever, into a republic, governed far more despotically by a Jewish oligarchy. Lenin has described this process in his works, and Lassalle himself alludes to it in his correspondence with his co-religionist Karl Marx. Nationalism leads to its own suicide when it has reached this level of intensity and density. Metternich saw the ultimate peril, but no one else did. For this reason, he hardly trusted anyone else, from France down to Russia. And how could things have been any different, when he had realized he was the only one to see the point of intersection of all the various forces corroding society in his day? For what reason, then, did a plan of this sort, stemming from such exceptional foresight and such detailed evaluation of the overall character of an age, not attain the results one might have legitimately expected? Before answering this question, we should hasten to point out that it would be unjust not to consider the uninterrupted peace which Christian Europe enjoyed between 1815 and 1853 as a great blessing for the peoples of the continent. During this time, there were no wars or serious crises, and none of the nervous tension among nations that has ruined our contemporaries' nerves over the course of subsequent years. Complete pacification for 40 years in a row represents a good record. Our grandfathers owed this to Metternich's anti-democratic view of international relations. Certainly it was great, but it might have come to much more. The reason for the ultimate failure of the work conceived at Vienna lies in the fact that a plan will only bear fruit if it is fully adopted and implemented, not if it strikes any sort of compromise, including a partial one. While far more consistent and complete than that of all later congresses and conferences, the work of the Congress of Vienna remained a compromise between the view of the Austrian Chancellor and the idiosyncrasies of the other participants. Metternich's thesis concerned a defensive and offensive alliance among all the Christian and absolutist monarchs of Europe. These rulers were to regard themselves as fathers to their peoples and brothers to one another. They were to mutually secure one another's frontiers as defined by the treaty, so as to avoid all discord, and jointly strive to oppose all subversive moves that might have threatened or simply challenged their shared dignity as absolute and divinely appointed sovereigns. This was the each for all and all for each of the kings. In other words, a white international or League of Nations of the right, an imperial and royal anticipation of President Wilson's democratic and Masonic dream. The Holy Alliance was doomed to failure right from the start for two reasons, which ultimately coincide, but which we shall treat separately. The first reason already contains the second as a potential. We shall start from it as it possesses a more general character. If we were to imagine ourselves standing by the banks of the Blue Danube in the year 1815, in that place where the Holy Alliance was first established, we would discover to our amazement that someone was missing among its many and highly distinguished godfathers. This was someone who by all reason ought to have acted as the keystone of the new political and social edifice that was then being built. It was the cornerstone Christ mentions in the gospel, and without which the kind of unity in diversity the Holy Alliance was aspiring towards cannot be attained. It was the rock, Peter, that ensured the unity and diversity of Christian nations from Constantine the Great down to Luther, Calvin, and their disciples. Since the late 15th century, there has no longer been any spiritual unity, only confessional and ideological divergences. The Reformation was the first revolutionary offensive, the first attack against order. The latter rests not on mere force, but on faith, which follows no criterion but itself. What we mean by this is that faith may resort to force, but ought not to be confused with any force seeking to artificially create a faith for itself, which it might then make use of. There is a veritable gulf between these two conceptions. While the Reformation as a religious revolution may not have killed the letter of divine right, it killed its spirit, leaving the second act of the subversive work up to social and political revolution. The Reformation killed it as far as the constitutional guarantee of absolute regimes is concerned, which rests on the moral law drawn from the gospel. This moral law, which is the ultimate resource for man and independent individuals against force and sheer numbers, which amount to the same thing, possesses absolute and universal value. It is always the same regardless of time and place, and is above the whims of the masses as well as those of princes and elites. To claim that authority is necessary for order is to speak only half the truth. Authority must also rest on something unchangeable and universal, not on what will be true today but wrong tomorrow. Nationalism. Otherwise, conflict will necessarily arise between today's truth and tomorrow's, between this truth and that. In such a case, paradoxical as it may seem, as local and temporal authorities become stronger and more confident in their truths, the more universal anarchy will spread. This may easily be observed today by gazing at the world from a bird's eye view, rather than by looking through a magnifying glass to see what is taking place within an area of a few square kilometers, only in a particular season. For authority to rest on something solid, it must rest on the notion of divine right, for this is the only thing solid and enduring, like God himself. Divine right, as the name itself suggests, is not the right of kings, nor that of the Pope. Rather, it is the right of the Christian God as it has been expressed through his law. Heads of state are but its vicars, the Pope merely being the first among all vicars. Joseph de Maistre, who lived at the time of the Congress of Vienna, was only half right in arguing that the Pope should be the moderator of kings. The Pope and the kings are merely interpreters of the law, each in their respective domains. In this regard, they act as its sovereign executors. The Pope nonetheless represents the only visible rallying symbol, a symbol of unity and diversity, which is to say, of what is true and unchangeable across time and space. Herein lies the essence of divine right. One might respond that monarchies of divine right have their origin in acts of force. Well, this is certainly the case if such acts of force become divine right, or rather, the divine right. It means they become subordinate to it. And this implies a duty as well as a right. In such manner, monarchies made their way back into the universal and unchangeable order of the great fold, abiding to the same creed and uniform catechism, the latter being but the creed in action. What more is needed in practice? At the very antipodes of divine right stands national will, which will be precisely true here but wrong there, true today but wrong tomorrow. The kings who chose the Reformation voted for what was destined to do away with the very principle and virtue of which they were reigning by God's grace to begin with. In wishing to free themselves from the yoke of God's word, they fell under the yoke of the incoherent words of men. Without realizing it, by bartering their divine right for national will, they sold their birthright for a plate of lentils. The demolition work begun by Protestantism was carried on by philosophizing, atheism, democratism, civicism, nationalism, and capitalism. With the advent of the Reformation, divine right ceased to exist. For some time it continued to subsist as pure virtuality, as in the case of those extinguished or vanished stars whose light still reaches us. Divine right, however, will never return to being reality. The Revolution was already contained in the Reformation, as there was a direct relation of cause and effect between the two. In the countries where the Reformation has triumphed, what has occurred is not any visible revolution, but rather a latent and progressive revolution which has led to the same result, namely the worship of abstraction and ideas in place of God, according to a sort of mythological divine right. As what stands at the summit of this new right is not what is superior, but what is inferior. What we literally have is a house built upside down.